The only Bronze Star awarded in the Second World War for writing a prayer went to a Catholic priest who'd never fired a shot, James O'Neill, 52 years old, chief chaplain of Patton's Third Army. On December 8, 1944, George Patton picked up the phone and gave him an order no general had ever given a chaplain. Write a formal request to God for clear weather, print it on cards, and put one in the pocket of every soldier in the army. 250,000 copies. That's how many were printed, around the clock. Patton didn't ask his men to pray quietly. He issued it as an operational directive, complete with a training letter, a distribution schedule, and a deadline. The cards reached the troops by December 14th. 2 days later, the Germans launched their last and largest offensive through the Ardennes in blinding snow and ground fog. Bastogne was surrounded. The Air Force couldn't fly, and 250,000 American soldiers were carrying the same 5x3-inch card in their pockets, asking God for clear skies that hadn't come in 3 months. If this kind of history is worth your time, subscribe and ring the bell. We don't run out of stories, and knowing you're out there is what keeps us digging. Patton's Third Army had crossed France in less than a month, from the Normandy hedgerows to the Moselle River. His tanks covered ground so fast that the maps at Supreme Headquarters couldn't keep up. Divisions that had been pinned down in the Bocage 2 months earlier were now sitting on the Franco-German border, and the mood at Third Army Headquarters was that one more hard push would carry them into Germany before Christmas. Then the rain started. It came in late September and didn't stop. Not for a week, not for a month. By the time Patton's men pushed into Lorraine, the countryside had turned into a swamp. Roads, most of them unpaved farm tracks, broke apart into knee-deep mud that sucked the treads off half-tracks and swallowed jeeps to their axles. Tanks threw their tracks trying to cross open ground. Supply trucks bogged down and had to be abandoned where they sat. Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice in mid-November. The ground, he told her, was covered in 4 inches of liquid mud. The rain wasn't heavy, he said, just constant. A slow, cold drizzle that filled every foxhole and turned every road into a drainage ditch. And then there was Metz. Metz was one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. It sat behind a ring of steel-reinforced concrete fortresses built at the turn of the century and strengthened by every army that had occupied them since. Fort Driant, 5 miles southwest of the city, was the key to the whole defensive belt. Most of it sat underground, behind armored pillboxes, a deep dry moat, and interlocking fields of fire that could shred anything moving in the open. Patton looked at it and called it an easy target. In late September, he sent the 5th Infantry Division to take it. The 5th hit Fort Driant on September 27th, with P-47 Thunderbolts dropping 1,000-pound bombs, tank destroyers firing at point-blank range, and 2 companies of infantry charging through the outer wire. The bombs bounced off reinforced concrete that was built to absorb exactly that punishment. The tank destroyers fired into pillboxes sunk too deep to reach. The infantry got pinned in the open within minutes. An engineer named Tucker, who'd been with the division from Normandy through the sprint across France, said it flatly. Driant was different. A second assault on October 3rd clawed onto the roof of the fort, and the men held that foothold for 2 days, fighting off German counterattacks that came boiling up through underground tunnels. When the Americans dug in on top, the German garrison called down artillery fire from neighboring forts onto their own position, preferring to shell themselves rather than let the Americans stay. Captain Jack Jerry, commanding the company at the deepest point of penetration, sent back a situation report so bleak it went straight up the chain of command. By mid-October, Patton pulled them out. The 5th Infantry Division had taken nearly 800 casualties cracking at a single fort and getting nowhere. Fort Driant held out until December 8th. The same morning, Patton picked up the phone and called his chaplain. Now, add the weather on top of that. The Third Army's big November offensive, originally set for November 5th, had to launch without the aerial bombardment that Bradley had promised. Rain fell every single day. On November 7th, a downpour ran for 24 straight hours. Patton couldn't wait any longer and sent his divisions forward on November 8th into prepared German positions with no air cover, no close support, and no prospect of getting any. They kept going like that, day after day, in conditions that belonged to 1918. Trench foot hit the Third Army like an epidemic. Most of the infantry were still wearing summer-issue uniforms from the race across France. Now they were standing in waterlogged foxholes in temperatures that dropped below freezing at night, with no winter boots, no overcoats, and no dry socks. The army hadn't seen trench foot in these numbers since the Western Front in 1918. Men's feet swelled, turned white, then grey, then black. The 26th Infantry Division alone reported over 3,000 cases during the November push. Across Patton's entire front, the aid stations filled up every morning with soldiers who'd pulled off their boots and couldn't get them back on. Some couldn't walk at all. They had to be carried out on stretchers, and the stretcher bearers were slipping in the same mud that had wrecked the men they were carrying. And if you're wondering what happened to the Air Force during all this, so was Patton. 19th Tactical Air Command, the fighter-bomber wing assigned to the Third Army, was supposed to be its long reach. P-47 Thunderbolts could wreck a panzer column in a single pass or tear apart a supply convoy 20 miles ahead of the front. In Lorraine, those planes sat on their airstrips for days at a time, sometimes a full week without a single sortie, grounded by fog and overcast that kept the ceiling below a few hundred feet. No conditions for dive bombing, no visibility for strafing. Patton's infantry and armor were doing everything alone, clearing towns building by building, pushing through minefields on foot, taking on armored counterattacks with nothing above them. For weeks at a time, Patton's ground troops fought without a single plane overhead. Between September and mid-December 1944, the Third Army suffered over 55,000 casualties in Lorraine. That's close to a third of every casualty Patton's army would take in the entire European war. And most of those men weren't lost in some famous armored breakout or dramatic river crossing. They were ground down in a day-after-day slog through mud, rain, and cold against German defenders who knew every ridge, held every hilltop, and had had months to dig in. Here's what made Lorraine different from anything else in Patton's career. Every problem he'd ever faced as a commander had the same answer: more speed, more aggression. Hit them before they can set up. Keep moving, and the enemy breaks. Patton's entire philosophy of war ran on that single conviction. Forward momentum solves everything. And across 3 campaigns on 2 continents, it had always delivered. In Lorraine, it didn't. And the thing that stopped it wasn't the German army. You can order a division to attack at dawn. You can fire a corps commander for moving too slowly. You can scream at the quartermaster until the winter boots show up on a truck. You can't order the clouds to break. You can't court-martial the weather. And every day the sky stayed shut, more men went into the mud and didn't come back. Patton had spent 30 years in uniform building a career on the idea that a commander's will could force open any deadlock. Lorraine was the first place where that idea ran into something that didn't care about his will, his reputation, or his 3 stars. By early December, the Third Army was still crawling forward, gains measured in yards. The Rhine was over 100 miles away. The daily weather briefings at Patton's headquarters in Nancy had turned into a loop of identical bad news. Rain tomorrow, fog the day after, low overcast through the weekend. His staff could plan attacks, but they couldn't plan air support. And every attack without air support cost more American lives than it should have. On November 7th, Patton had written in his diary about a night 2 years earlier. He'd been aboard the cruiser Augusta, steaming toward North Africa for the invasion. The seas had been rough, and the landing looked impossible. Then, around 4 in the afternoon, the wind dropped, the swells flattened out, the invasion went forward. Patton believed that break in the weather had been an answer to prayer. He'd never forgotten it. Now it was December 8th, 1944. 3 months of rain over Lorraine, without a break. Patton picked up the telephone at his headquarters in Nancy and asked to be connected to Chaplain O'Neill. The phone rang at Chaplain O'Neill's office in the Caserne Molitor at 11 in the morning. The voice on the other end was Patton's. "Do you have a good prayer for weather? We must do something about those rains if we are to win the war." James Hugh O'Neill was 52 years old, a Catholic priest from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, who joined the Army chaplaincy in 1926. He'd served at posts from the Philippines to Fort Bragg, and by December 1944, he was chief chaplain of the Third Army, responsible for 486 chaplains, covering 32 denominations, and 250,000 soldiers spread across a front that ran from Luxembourg to the Saar. O'Neill knew Patton well enough to understand the man's faith wasn't for show. Patton was an Episcopalian who attended services regularly, read his Bible, and had been known to drop to his knees in prayer before a major operation. He wasn't quiet about it either. Patton believed with total seriousness that God took a direct hand in the outcome of battles, and he said so openly to anyone who'd listen. O'Neill also knew that when Patton wanted something, he wanted it finished before you'd had time to ask why. O'Neill went back to his desk and started looking. He pulled out every prayer book and devotional manual on his shelf. Nothing fit. There were prayers for the sick, prayers for the dying, prayers for victory, prayers for peace. There wasn't a single one that asked God, specifically and plainly, to stop the rain so that an army could move and fight. O'Neill sat down, pulled a 5x3-inch filing card from his desk drawer, and wrote one himself. The opening line asked the Almighty to restrain the immoderate rains. The rest asked for fair weather for battle, for the strength to advance from victory to victory, and for God to crush the oppression and wickedness of the enemy. 4 sentences, ending with Amen. It took O'Neill less than an hour. He'd just composed the most famous prayer of the Second World War on a piece of cardboard the size of a postcard. Then O'Neill had an idea. Christmas was 17 days away. The men were cold, wet, exhausted, and a long way from home. O'Neill flipped the card over and drafted a Christmas greeting from the commanding general, wishing every officer and soldier a Merry Christmas, expressing full confidence in their courage, devotion, and skill in battle. He put Patton's name at the bottom. Anything that lifted the troops' morale, O'Neill figured, would sit well with the general. Patton called O'Neill in for a face-to-face meeting later that afternoon. The chaplain walked into the office at 3rd Army Headquarters, expecting a quick sign-off on the prayer card. What he walked into was a 40-minute conversation about the power of prayer. Patton sat behind his desk, looked at O'Neill, and started talking. Not about the operational situation, not about the weather forecast, about prayer. Patton told O'Neill there were 3 ways men got what they wanted: by planning, by working, and by praying. He brought up Dr. Alexis Carrel, the Nobel Prize-winning surgeon who'd recently said that prayer was one of the most powerful forms of energy a human being could generate. Patton leaned across the desk and told his chaplain that these reins were the margin between defeat and victory. If we all pray, Patton said, it will be like plugging in on a current whose source is in heaven. I believe that prayer completes that circuit. It is power. And if soldiers didn't pray, wherever they were, Patton added, they'd crack up. In Patton's mind, this wasn't mysticism, it was mechanics. Prayer worked the same way a concentrated artillery barrage worked. You aimed it at a specific target. You fired it with maximum intensity, and if your aim was right, you got results. The target right now was the weather over Lorraine. With that, Patton stood up from behind his desk, which was his way of telling you the meeting was over. O'Neill took the hint and went back to his office to get to work. Now, O'Neill was a career military chaplain who'd been dealing with generals for nearly 20 years, and he pushed back. The way O'Neill told it, years later, he pointed out to Patton that chaplains didn't ordinarily pray for good weather so that armies could go out and fight more effectively. It was a reasonable objection from a priest. Patton's response was immediate and had no theology in it at all. The general wanted to know if O'Neill was trying to teach him theology or if he was the chaplain of the Third Army. The question wasn't really a question. O'Neill got the message. Patton wanted a prayer, and arguing about whether chaplains should pray for tactical weather wasn't going to change anything about the next 24 hours. Patton didn't stop at the card. He told O'Neill to draft a formal training letter on the subject of prayer, addressed to every chaplain in the army. Write about nothing else, Patton said, just the importance of prayer. O'Neill went back to his quarters and wrote what became Training Letter Number 5. It ran several pages and opened by reminding the chaplains of what the Third Army had already accomplished: the march from Normandy Beach across France to the German border with the wreckage of the enemy behind them, and argued that this record alone should convince even the most skeptical soldier that God had been riding with their banner. The letter moved from that claim straight into an order. It told the chaplains to intensify their faith in prayer, not just among themselves, but with every believing man in the ranks, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, and Christian alike. It didn't stop at chapel services. It told them to urge their men to pray everywhere, in every circumstance. Pray when driving, pray when fighting, pray alone, pray with others, pray by night and pray by day. Pray for the cessation of the immoderate rains, for good weather for battle. Pray for victory. When Patton read the draft the next morning, he didn't change a word. The only thing he did was expand the distribution list. O'Neill had addressed it to the chaplains. Patton wanted it going to every organization commander down to regiment level, 3,200 copies. And because the order came directly from Patton, distribution was completed on December 11th and 12th, 2 days ahead of the December 14th dateline. O'Neill later noted that strictly speaking, it was the Army commander's letter, not his. So now think about the logistics of what Patton had just set in motion. The prayer cards needed to reach every soldier in the Third Army, all 250,000 of them. Patton passed the order to Colonel David Tully, the Assistant Army Engineer, who handed it to the 664th Engineer Topographical Company. This was a unit whose normal job was printing maps and terrain overlays for combat operations. Now they were printing prayers. The 664th worked around the clock. Their presses ran day and night, turning out 250,000 cards, 5 by 3 inches each. The prayer on the front and Patton's Christmas greeting on the back. These were men whose usual job was printing grid coordinates and contour lines for artillery officers. Now they were typesetting a prayer to God and a Christmas message from a 3-star general, and they were doing it on the same equipment. Colonel Robert Cummings, the Adjutant General, supervised the distribution. The cards went through normal supply channels, loaded onto the same trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations. By December 14th, every soldier in the Third Army had one in his pocket or tucked inside his helmet liner. If you step back and look at what Patton had just done, it looks less like a religious gesture and more like a military operation. He didn't ask his men to pray privately. He didn't suggest they visit the chaplain when they had a free moment. He issued prayer as an operational directive, with a printing order, a distribution plan, a supply chain, and a deadline. There was a training letter going out to 3,200 officers. There was a logistics tale moving 250,000 printed cards through the same channels as food and fuel. The whole operation had taken 6 days from phone call to completion, faster than most supply requisitions moved through the Third Army system. Patton wasn't treating prayer and military command as two separate categories. He was running prayer the way he ran an offensive: objective, plan, execution, timeline. And the objective wasn't vague spiritual comfort. It was specific, measurable, and operational. Clear skies over Lorraine so that American fighter bombers could fly. George Patton had added God to the Third Army's order of battle. The cards had been in the soldiers' pockets for 2 days when, on December 16th, the Germans launched the largest offensive on the Western Front since Normandy. Every one of those 250,000 prayers was about to matter in ways that nobody, including Patton, had planned for. On December 16, 1944, 25 German divisions came out of the Ardennes forest in a wall of snow and fog. Over 200,000 troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, and close to 2,000 artillery pieces hit the thinnest stretch of the Allied line, an 80-mile front held by 4 American divisions, 2 of them brand new and 2 exhausted from the fighting in the Hürtgen forest. The attack came without warning. Allied intelligence had missed the build-up almost entirely. Oscar Koch, Patton's G2 at Third Army, was one of the few intelligence officers who'd flagged unusual German rail movements east of the Ardennes in the days before. And even Koch hadn't predicted the scale of what was coming. The weather that had tortured the Third Army in Lorraine was now doing something far worse in the Ardennes. It was protecting the Germans. Low cloud, ground fog, and heavy snow cut visibility to near zero. American forward observers couldn't see German tanks until they were on top of them. Reconnaissance planes couldn't get off the ground. And the thousands of Allied bombers and fighter bombers sitting on airstrips from England to eastern France, the single greatest advantage the Allies held over the German army, were as useless as if they'd never been built. The Luftwaffe, which hadn't been a serious threat in months, could fly because the German pilots knew the terrain and didn't need to see the ground. Allied pilots needed visual contact with their targets, and there wasn't any. So, the ground troops fought alone. The initial German assault tore through the 106th Infantry Division, a green outfit that had been on the line for less than a week. 2 of its 3 regiments, roughly 7,000 men, were surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge and forced to surrender, the largest mass capitulation of American troops in the European War. The 28th Infantry Division, already chewed up from weeks in the Hurtgen, was hit head-on and fell back fighting through a dozen small Belgian villages. German armoured columns pushed west through the gaps, heading for the Meuse River crossings, and in the middle of all of it sat Bastogne. Bastogne was a crossroads town in the Belgian Ardennes, where 7 major roads converged. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the road network for 50 miles in every direction. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed in by truck from a rest area near Reims, got there just ahead of the German spearheads on December 19th and dug in around the town's perimeter. Elements of the 10th Armoured Division and scraps of retreating units joined them. Within 48 hours, the Germans had Bastogne completely surrounded. The situation inside the pocket deteriorated fast. Ammunition was running low. Artillery batteries were rationing shells to 10 rounds per gun per day, a fraction of what they normally fired. Medical supplies were almost gone. The division surgeon was operating on wounded men in a makeshift aid station in a Belgian garage without adequate anesthesia, and the seriously wounded were being loaded onto any vehicle heading east in the hope of finding a field hospital that hadn't been overrun. Resupply by air was impossible because the same overcast that grounded the fighter bombers also grounded the transport planes. The 101st was fighting with what it had carried in on its back, and that supply was shrinking every hour. On December 22nd, the German commander sent a formal surrender demand under a white flag, warning that annihilation of the Bastogne garrison would follow if they didn't capitulate. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander who'd been woken from a nap to read the ultimatum, gave his one-word reply, "Nuts." The response became famous overnight. What didn't make the headlines was that McAuliffe's men were running out of everything they needed to keep fighting, and the only thing that could resupply them was an airplane that couldn't fly. What made the situation desperate wasn't the German numbers, it was the weather. Brigadier General Dick Nugent, commanding the 29th Tactical Air Command, told his staff that several days of clear weather would end the German offensive. He was probably right. American and British air power could cut the German supply lines, wreck the panzer columns strung out on narrow forest roads, and drop supplies to Bastogne. The problem was that the weather forecast said nothing of the kind. Major Fuller, the 9th Air Force meteorologist, was asked by a colleague what he'd do if the skies cleared tomorrow. Fuller turned away and muttered that he'd shoot himself. It was a joke, barely. Nobody in the Allied Weather Service was predicting a break. On December 19th, Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at the Verdun barracks of the French army. The building was a former military school. The meeting room was a cold stone chamber on the 2nd floor, heated by a single pot-bellied stove that barely took the edge off. Outside, the temperature was below freezing, and the sky was the same flat grey it had been for weeks. Eisenhower sat at the head of a long table, his face drawn and grey with strain. Bradley was there. So were Devers, Strong, Tedder, and a dozen senior staff officers. Every man in the room knew that if the Germans reached the Meuse crossings, the Allied front would be split in two, and the war could go on for another year. Eisenhower opened by saying he wanted only cheerful faces at the table. Nobody smiled. Then he asked for options. The discussion turned to how fast the Allied armies could counterattack the German flanks, and that was when Patton spoke up. Patton told Eisenhower he could attack the southern flank of the German Bulge with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went quiet. Some of the British officers exchanged looks. What Patton was proposing meant pulling the Third Army out of its offensive in the Saar, turning it 90 degrees to the north, and moving over 100,000 men and their equipment over icy roads in the middle of winter, in the dark, through a blizzard, to a jump-off point they hadn't even reconnoitered. Eisenhower's response was sharp. "Don't be fatuous, George." Patton wasn't being fatuous. What nobody in that room except Patton's own staff knew was that Patton had seen this coming. Oscar Koch's intelligence reports had put Patton on alert as early as December 12th. By December 15th, Patton had ordered his staff to draw up 3 contingency plans for breaking off the Saar offensive and wheeling north. Plan A was a turn toward Luxembourg. Plan B aimed at Bastogne. Plan C swung even further east. All 3 had march routes, timetables, and logistics schedules already sketched out. When Patton said 48 hours in that cold room in Verdun, he wasn't guessing. He was reading from a plan that was already 3 days old. Patton's aide, Colonel Charles Codman, wrote that an electric excitement ran through the room when Patton laid out his plan. Eisenhower was skeptical, but he gave the go-ahead. Patton walked out of the Verdun barracks and called his chief of staff, Hobart Gay, at 3rd Army headquarters. The code word was simple. Gay already knew which plan to execute. On December 22nd, at 6:30 in the morning, the 3rd Army attacked. The 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division turned north from the Saar front and drove toward Bastogne through a blizzard. What Patton had done in those 48 hours was staggering by any logistical standard. He disengaged 3 divisions from active combat, pulled them off the line, rerouted their supply chains, shifted their artillery, reassigned their fuel allocations, and sent them 75 miles north on roads that were covered in ice and packed with retreating traffic. Snow piled onto the roads. Tanks slid off icy curves. Infantry marched in columns through drifts that came up to their thighs. And every man in those columns had a 5x3-inch prayer card in his pocket, asking God for the one thing that would make the difference between a successful relief and a frozen stalemate. The skies over the Ardennes stayed shut. The forecast for December 23rd showed no improvement. The fighter bombers sat on their airstrips. The transport planes that could have dropped food and ammunition to the 101st Airborne sat in their hangars. And Eisenhower, at SHAEF headquarters, wrote in his own diary on December 21st what sounded remarkably like a prayer of his own. "This is the shortest day. How I pray that it may, by some miracle, mark the beginning of improved weather." Patton had done everything a general could do. He'd predicted the crisis before his own supreme commander saw it coming. He'd planned for it while the rest of SHAEF was still celebrating the German retreat. He'd turned an entire army 90 degrees in 2 days, a feat that military historians would later call one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the war. He'd thrown 3 divisions north through a blizzard on 2 days' notice while keeping the rest of his front from collapsing. All of it was military professionalism at its absolute peak, and none of it could put a single plane in the air. The prayer cards were still in the soldiers' pockets, the skies were still shut, and Bastogne was still surrounded. On the night of December 22nd, the forecast for the Ardennes called for continued overcast, snow, and ground fog through the end of the week. Patton's 3rd Army had been attacking northward through a blizzard for nearly 18 hours, and the fighter bombers that were supposed to support the advance hadn't left the ground. The men of the 4th Armored Division were pushing toward Bastogne on roads so icy that tanks were sliding sideways and trucks had to chain up all 4 wheels. The 101st Airborne was still surrounded, still rationing ammunition, still operating on wounded soldiers without proper supplies. The weather briefing at SHAEF that evening offered nothing. The meteorologists saw no break in the pattern. Nobody in the Allied chain of command expected what happened next. Sometime before dawn, on December the 23rd, the temperature dropped hard. The air went still. And then, as the first grey light came up over the Ardennes, something happened that 250,000 soldiers had been carrying a prayer card in their pockets asking for. The fog lifted. It didn't thin out gradually, it pulled apart, and behind it was a sky that hadn't been seen over Western Europe in weeks. The overcast broke into scattered clouds, and then those scattered clouds thinned, and by full daylight the sky over the Ardennes was a clean, hard blue from horizon to horizon. The temperature had dropped well below freezing overnight, and the cold snap that cleared the air also froze the mud, giving tanks and trucks a solid surface to move on for the first time in months. An American soldier on the ground near Bastogne would later describe what he saw that morning as the most beautiful sunrise of the war. Along the foxhole lines, men who'd spent a week fighting blind looked up and saw open sky. Some of them reached into their pockets and touched the prayer card, At airfields across England and eastern France, the word went out before breakfast. Visibility unlimited, ceiling unlimited. Every plane that could fly was going up. The response was massive, coordinated, and fast. 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe scrambled its heavy bomber groups. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lifted off from airfields across Lincolnshire and East Anglia, formed up over the English Channel, and turned east toward the Ardennes. These were the big strategic bombers, normally reserved for hitting factories and rail yards deep inside Germany. On December 23rd, they were dropping their payloads on German supply lines, road junctions, and railheads directly behind the Bulge. Below them, the 9th Air Force and the Royal Air Force's 2nd Tactical Air Command threw everything they had into the fight. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, B-26 Marauders, British Typhoons and Mosquitoes roared east in wave after wave. On that single day, Allied tactical aircraft flew over 1,000 sorties across the Ardennes, more than the total for the previous week combined. The effect on the German offensive was immediate and devastating. Panzer divisions that had been advancing freely under the cover of bad weather were suddenly exposed from above. German supply convoys that had been moving in the open were caught on roads with no room to turn around and no cover to hide under. P-47 pilots from the 354th Fighter Group dove on columns of the Panzer Lehr division, strafing and dropping 500-pound bombs on tanks that were strung out bumper to bumper on a single-lane forest road. The tank crews had nowhere to go. Vehicles that weren't hit directly were blocked by the burning wrecks ahead of them. The 302nd Fighter Group reported destroying or damaging over 60 vehicles in a single afternoon. All across the Bulge, the pattern repeated. German commanders, who'd been moving freely in daylight for a week, were suddenly forced to move only at night. And even at night, the burning wreckage along the roads marked their positions for the next morning's airstrikes. And then the transports came for Bastogne. C-47 Skytrains from the 441st Troop Carrier Group and other units flew directly over the surrounded town in broad daylight, something that would have been suicide 24 hours earlier, and kicked out bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, food, and blankets by parachute. Pathfinder teams on the ground inside the perimeter marked drop zones with colored smoke panels, and pilots held their runs steady through German anti-aircraft fire to put the bundles as close to the markers as possible. Paratroopers and engineers sprinted out from their foxholes to drag the crates back under cover. Over 200 resupply sorties were flown to Bastogne in the days following the weather break. The 101st Airborne, which had been counting rifle rounds and sharing the last morphine syrettes between wounded men, was suddenly getting everything it needed to fight. For the first time since the encirclement began, McAuliffe's garrison had enough ammunition to go on the offensive. And if you'd been standing at Patton's headquarters in Luxembourg City that morning, you'd have seen the general walk to the window, look up at the blue sky, and reach for his diary. What he wrote was a single line about the weather. The profanity and the satisfaction were both unmistakable, and the meaning was simple. This was a day to hit the enemy with everything the Third Army had, and now, finally, the Air Force could do its part. Patton went further than his diary. Sometime that day, he walked into the chapel at the Fondation Pescatore in Luxembourg City, knelt down, and said his own prayer. It wasn't the formal, measured language O'Neill had written on the card. It was pure Patton. He addressed God the way he addressed a subordinate who'd been underperforming. The last 14 days, Patton told the Almighty, had been straight from a very unpleasant place. He wanted to know what was going on at God's headquarters. Then he got to the point. All he was asking for was 4 days of clear weather. 4 days, so his planes could fly, so his fighter bombers could hit the German columns, so his artillery could see its target. Patton wasn't asking for a miracle. He was submitting a requisition. The clear weather held. It held for December 24th. It held through Christmas Day. It held into the 26th, the 27th, the 28th. 6 consecutive days of clear, cold skies over the Ardennes, the longest unbroken stretch of good weather since September. Every one of those days, the Allied air forces flew hundreds of sorties, systematically destroying the logistics that kept the German offensive alive. Fuel dumps were hit, railheads were wrecked, bridge crossings were bombed, ammunition convoys were caught on open roads and torn apart. The German advance, which had been gaining ground for a week, ground to a halt under clear blue skies that Patton had asked for and gotten. On December 26th, at 4:50 in the afternoon, a Sherman tank named Cobra King from the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, rolled up to the last German positions south of Bastogne. First Lieutenant Charles Boggis was in the lead tank. Boggis's crew fought through a final screen of German infantry and anti-tank fire, pushed past the tree line, and made contact with engineers from the 101st Airborne's 326th Battalion dug in along the southern perimeter. Boggis popped his hatch and shouted down to the paratroopers. The first question from the ground was whether Boggis was from the 4th Armored. He was. The siege was broken. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for a single column of vehicles, and it would take days of hard fighting to widen it. The Germans counter-attacked the relief corridor repeatedly over the next week. Bastogne wasn't truly secure until well into January. The 101st was no longer alone, and the supplies were flowing in. Nobody can prove that 250,000 prayer cards caused the weather to change on December 23rd. Meteorology has its own explanations for high-pressure systems moving over Western Europe in late December. The cold snap that cleared the skies was a natural atmospheric event, and it would have happened whether or not a single soldier had prayed for it. That's the rational answer, and it's almost certainly the correct one. What the rational answer doesn't account for is what it felt like on the ground. 250,000 men had been carrying the same small card for over a week, reading the same 4 sentences, asking for the same thing. The card had been printed by a topographical company, distributed through ammo supply lines, and tucked into pockets and helmet liners alongside photographs of wives and girlfriends. And on the morning when the surrounded, the freezing, and the outgunned needed clear skies more desperately than at any point in the war, the sky opened. Patton believed it was God's answer. O'Neill believed it was God's answer. The men in the foxholes around Bastogne, watching C-47s drop ammunition out of a blue sky that had been grey for a month, weren't debating meteorology. They were watching the thing they'd prayed for happen in front of them. The prayer cards didn't need theology to carry weight. They carried it on their own. Sometime in early January 1945, Patton summoned O'Neill to his headquarters in Luxembourg. The weather had held. The offensive had been stopped. Bastogne was relieved. Patton was in high spirits. When O'Neill walked into the office, Patton grinned at him. "Well, Padre, our prayers worked," Patton said. "I knew they would." Then Patton reached over and cracked O'Neill on the side of his steel helmet with his riding crop. It was Patton's way of saying thank you. Before that meeting, Patton had already arranged for O'Neill to receive the Bronze Star. The citation didn't mention theology, faith, or divine intervention. It was a military decoration pinned on a priest's uniform for writing a prayer and distributing it under operational conditions. O'Neill later noted that he was, as far as he knew, the only man in the Second World War to receive a medal for composing a prayer. Patton's comment at the ceremony was blunt. "Chaplain, you're the most popular man in this headquarters. You sure standing good with the Lord and soldiers." The prayer card came back to where it started. A 5x3-inch piece of cardboard, printed by an engineer company that normally made maps, distributed through the same supply trucks that carried ammunition, carried in the pockets of 250,000 men through the worst month of the war in Europe. It had been ordered by a general who believed prayer was a weapon, written by a priest who'd pointed out that chaplains didn't usually pray for fighting weather, and delivered to soldiers who didn't know or care which of the two was responsible for the words on the front. What they knew was that they'd carried it, they'd read it, and the skies had cleared. Patton spent his entire career as the most aggressive commander in the American Army. His confidence in his own ability to force events was total. In every crisis he'd ever faced, the answer had been the same. More speed, more pressure, more attack. Lorraine was the first time none of that worked. And in the one moment when everything he could command, every tank, every gun, every division, was useless, without clear skies, Patton did something that no amount of stars on his collar would have predicted. He asked for help, not from Eisenhower, not from Washington. He asked 250,000 soldiers to pray with him. And whether the answer came from a high-pressure system drifting east across the Atlantic or from somewhere else entirely, Patton never doubted where it came from. O'Neill served out the rest of the war as 3rd Army chaplain. He retired from the Army as a brigadier general, went back to parish work, and spent his last years as a priest at Sacred Heart Church in Pueblo, Colorado. He died in 1972. O'Neill didn't publish his own account of how the prayer came to be written until 1971, 27 years after he'd sat down at his desk in Nancy with a filing card and a problem no prayer book could solve. The 5x3-inch card he wrote that morning is still one of the most recognized artifacts of the Second World War. The man who ordered it printed never stopped believing it worked.